Picture this, 90,000 roaring fans at Wembley Stadium. It's 2008. Your team just lifted a massive trophy, and you are entirely on top of the world. But then, just 2 years later, that exact same club makes history for all the wrong reasons. They become the very first Premier League team to go completely bankrupt. How on earth does that happen?
Yeah, we're talking about Portsmouth, going from FA Cup winners to totally bust in the blink of an eye. And you know what's really wild? They aren't the only ones. We've seen massive, historic clubs like Parma, Deportivo de La Coruña, and Bury FC suffer this exact same devastating fate.
Take Bury FC, who were literally expelled from the league in 2019. The truly terrifying thing about all of this is that none of these collapses were just random accidents. These weren't small clubs, and the people running them certainly weren't stupid. But every single one of them tumbled down the exact same 5-step staircase into darkness.
So, let's look at the anatomy of a football bankruptcy. To understand why this keeps happening, you've got to realize one crucial thing. A football club is not a normal business. A normal business exists to make money, right? Well, a football club exists to win. And that single difference is what ultimately kills it. It all kicks off with stage 1, overreach. This is where a club gets a little taste of success and bets the house on endless good times. To climb the league, they splurge on massive transfer fees and lock players into huge multi-year wage contracts. They basically trap themselves in a massive financial promise that they can only afford if they literally never stop winning.
But the winning always stops eventually, doesn't it? And that brings us to stage 2, the revenue cliff. When a club misses out on qualifying for the Champions League, or worse, gets relegated, they fall off an absolute cliff financially. We're talking losing more than half of their TV income overnight. But here's the catch. They are still legally bound to pay those top-tier Premier League wages. That massive, terrifying gap between plummeting income and sky-high wages is exactly where clubs go to die.
To plug that massive gap, the club desperately moves to stage 3, leverage. They end up mortgaging their own stadium just to get emergency loans. The club mutates into a highly toxic asset, which inevitably drags them into stage 4, ownership churn. They get passed around through a revolving door of fake saviors. You know the type, owners who swoop in, buy the club for absolute pennies, and then just strip out whatever remaining value they can find.
And that whole mess leads straight to the final stage, insolvency. Unpaid taxes pile up to the ceiling, which eventually forces the club into administration. The league steps in and hits the club with brutal points deductions. That pretty much guarantees relegation, which strips away even more of their revenue, and boom, you've got an unstoppable downward spiral right to the very bottom.
Let's see how this actually plays out in the real world with our first case study, the fall of a European giant, Parma.
Now, if you grew up watching football in the 90s, you definitely remember Parma. They won the UEFA Cup, not the Champions League, despite what a lot of people seem to misremember. But here's the thing, their incredible success wasn't actually built on football income. It was entirely propped up by Parmalat, a massive dairy company that eventually imploded in one of the absolute largest corporate frauds in European history.
Once that Parmalat money tap was shut off, Parma hit the revenue cliff going 100 miles an hour. They slid down the table and got relegated. Then came the ownership churn. Believe it or not, this legendary club was absurdly sold for just €1 single. Yeah, about £1. They were passed along to owners who literally couldn't afford to pay the players' wages. One of these so-called saviors was even banned from football for money laundering. You really couldn't make this stuff up if you tried. By early 2015, the insolvency was absolute. It was a complete disaster. Players hadn't been paid for months. The electricity to the stadium was literally cut off because they couldn't pay the bills. It actually got so bad that someone hung a handmade sign on the chained stadium gates that just read, "Closed because of robbery." Eventually, the court stepped in and officially declared them bankrupt. And the debt? A staggering €200 million. No buyer in their right mind would touch that kind of mess. So, they were dumped straight down into the amateur 4th division. But here is the amazing twist. The fans absolutely refused to let their club die. They rallied, resurrected the team as Parma Calcio 1913, and pulled off an unbelievable 3 promotions in 3 years to climb right back into Serie A.
So Parma proved a club can eventually come back. But our next case study, Portsmouth, shows just how incredibly fast that spiral can spin.
4. That is the mind-boggling number of different owners Portsmouth went through in a single season. Remember that 2008 FA Cup win? Well, it completely hid their massive financial overreach. But then the global financial crisis hit,
Each new owner arrived promising to be the rescuer the club desperately needed, but the harsh reality was none of them could actually fund the club.
The House of Cards completely collapsed on February 26, 2010. The taxman finally called in the debts, and Portsmouth officially became the very first Premier League club to enter administration. As punishment, they took a devastating 9-point deduction. That basically sealed their relegation and violently accelerated their total collapse.
It was a total free fall. They plummeted all the way from playing European football down to League Two, the fourth tier of English football, in just 5 years. And honestly, they only survived total liquidation because the Pompey Supporters Trust managed to raise the money and buy the club outright in 2013. The fans literally steadied the ship before eventually selling to a new, stable owner.
Which brings us to a massive question. When a club hits the absolute floor, who is buying the wreckage?
When a massive sporting institution goes bust, there are generally 3 types of buyers circling the carcass. First, you've got the fans. They bring all the romance and the passion, but let's be real, they rarely have the massive amounts of cash needed for a modern payroll. Second, you have the speculators and investment funds. These guys view distressed clubs purely as cheap assets that can flip for a quick profit. And third is the most powerful player of all in modern football, the specialist lenders.
See, when normal high street banks absolutely refuse to touch a struggling football club, these specialist funds step right in. For example, there's a fund linked to Michael Dell's family that has loaned tens of millions to clubs across English football, like Southampton. And they aren't doing this out of the goodness of their hearts. They are charging incredibly steep interest rates, hovering right around 9.14%.
But here is the real power grab. And honestly, what's truly terrifying about this entire system? It's the security they demand on those loans. To get the money, clubs have to pledge the absolute only irreplaceable things they own as collateral: their stadium and their training ground. If the club defaults on that loan, the lenders take the real estate, period. It essentially makes these financial institutions the true, quiet masters of modern football.
So, how do you spot this happening to your own club? Let's talk about the early warning signs.
If you want to know if your club is in trouble before the gates actually get chained shut, watch for these 5 major warning signs. First, late wages. This is the absolute smoke before the fire. If the players or the taxman aren't getting paid on time, the cash is already gone. Then, look out for the club borrowing against the stadium. Watch for a revolving door of random owners. Keep an eye out for them selling off star players without reinvesting a dime back into the squad. And finally, the ultimate red flag, winding up petitions in court. These are exactly the same 5 stages of collapse we just talked about, just viewed from the stands.
Because here is the brutal truth. Whether we're talking about Parma, Portsmouth, Deportivo, or Bury, the only element that ever survives the absolute wreckage of a football bankruptcy isn't the billionaire owner. It certainly isn't the leveraged buyout firm. It is always the fans, the people who absolutely refuse to walk away from their community, no matter how bad it gets.
And as long as football values endless spending over actual sustainability, the grim reality is your club could be next. Well, that wraps up our explainer on the anatomy of a football club collapse. Tell me down in the comments which club's financial collapse should we go deep on next. Let me know, and make sure you hit subscribe so you don't miss our upcoming deep dive explainer into how those specialist lenders are quietly taking over the sport. See you next time.